So for our guest this evening, or tonight, it's tonight here in Northern Ireland. It's quite late. It's after 10 o'clock. I'd like to introduce Dominic Montague. I'm delighted to have Dominic as our kind of representative provocateur from Outburst. And just before I say a little about Dominic, just to say that idea of provocateur was that this project is the process. So the whole project is not necessarily about end results. We do hope that some interesting art might happen, some interesting collaborations might happen out of this, but it's the conversation. And that's why we've invited people who are provocateurs, people who are doing things in their own work that are provocative or that have interesting ideas that might just get us thinking. And Dominic is certainly someone for me who's done that in terms of Outburst. Dominic's been a theatre practitioner for many years. I don't know how many exactly, Dominic, but you can talk a little bit more about that when you give your presentation. But I've mainly worked with Dominic probably over the last 4 or 5 years when we worked on a project together called Quartered, which I'm sure Dominic might tell you about, which was an audio piece that you had to tour around a certain area and heard a story, but saw the places within the story. It's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it was kind of like a gay love story, and it was really wonderful. And it was one of the first times we'd done something like that digitally, and people loved it. And it had started at Outburst, but I think it's been in about 3 or 4 other festivals since then. And it was one of those things that was able to just keep going on and on. It's wonderful. So Dominic was one of the first people that came into my head when we wanted to commission something new this year, in a year that we've learned about what people want. We want to do digital work. We want to do work that's accessible to people. But we also feel that people maybe are tired of just sitting at computers a lot of the time. I say this ironically with us all sitting at computers. But the question for me was, how do we use the technology we have in interesting ways that are still accessible? So Dominic is doing another audio piece for this year in collaboration with a musician in Belfast. And I'm sure, again, he'll tell you a little bit about that. It's called Calling the Corners. And it's about queer people and our space and how I suppose we inhabit that space in certain ways, but also taking in Celtic and Irish spirituality. That's my take on it. I won't go into any more detail, but just to say thank you so much, Dominic. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about how you do that and what your feeling is, particularly in this moment as well. I'm sure we can have questions and answers. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Hello. First of all, I would like to say thank you, Natalia. And I'm sitting right now to say thank you to the festivals and to all the provocateurs for such a wonderful experience over the last 2 weeks. I've been very grateful to hear all that's been shared and to feel a sense of togetherness with you, even from behind a computer screen, potentially thousands of miles away. It is a really beautiful thing to be in this collapsing of space, which allows us to be together, regardless of geography and time zone. It reminded me of the power of the internet to provide community and connection, instead of being a place where those things usually go up in flames. So thank you for that. When I thought about the idea of translating presence, I thought a lot about space and containment, that every act of translation is perhaps the quest to find an appropriate container to best carry the essence of something so it can be communicated. Like water drawn from a well and poured into a succession of ever smaller vessels until it finally reaches the table and can be shared and drawn. I wondered how much of that water and how much of that meaning is lost on that journey. Where does that journey begin? Where does the first act of translation occur? As none of us came into the world with language or culture already installed, then the first act of translation is how we interpret our own ideas and emotions as they are given shape by words and customs, how we contain our uncontainable selves using the tools we are given, the words we inherit, the stories we are told, the rituals which initiate us. Words, stories, and cultures are containers into which we pour ourselves so that we can see the shape of ourselves and that we can share that shape with others. There is an unfairness in that we must define ourselves using languages and codes and cultures that so often erase us. We have had to build identities by picking through a series of containers that were never really meant for us, do not suit the shape of us, and do not best serve us. Not only in youth, but every single day, we are in constant translation. Translating that intangible self into tangible thoughts is then the first translation. The second is the translation in the body. It is that inner mechanism by which we have to choose what private things to make public. What words do we dare use? How do we hold ourselves? How do we act? Before we even draw breath to speak, or we engage our neurons or nerve endings and muscles, we go through the second translation. What is safe? What is appropriate? What can I get away with? This is the last point, that we have privacy. Once it is public, it no longer belongs only to us, but to the world and to society. We are translated into presence. This is, of course, a very deeply human thing, but as queer humans, we have a unique insight into it. As does every human being in a community who has been marginalized, disenfranchised, criminalized, and decentered. We know the outer limits of cultural containment because we have had to navigate them. We know the edges of the world because we have existed on them, which interestingly is something that the world needs a lot of right now. In my work, I've used digital technologies to explore the intersection of the personal and the public and how we navigate that second translation. I say digital technologies like it's very complex. I use audio. It's very low tech, but it's effective. I think audio is an interesting medium because it occupies the same space as our own inner monologue. It can walk side by side with it. It is a whisper rather than a shout, a question rather than an answer. It is a shared moment where we can explore our queerness before it is again translated and made public. The experience of any queer identity is so specific to the climate, culture, and time in which it takes place. Mine is based in Ireland. What it means to be queer in Ireland today is very different to other places. What it means to be queer in the exact postcode or district where I am right now is very different to 100 meters away. What it means to be queer in Ireland today is very different than 5, 10, 100 years ago. But those first and second translations have been constant. How they manifest are different, but across time and space, as queer people, we share in the knowledge of them. Our queer experience unites us and collapses time and distance. For a long time, I thought that the last threshold to freedom was being able to say what we want and act as we want freely, to be entirely free from anxiety and pain in that second translation of the private to the public. But recently, and inspired very much by the last 2 weeks, I wonder if the last threshold to freedom lies in the first translation of how we translate ourselves to ourselves. Digital and virtual spaces such as the one that we currently occupy give us a realm in which to interrogate this first translation. They give us scope to collectively communicate and co-create new cultures and new words that may better serve us. They allow us to build new containers to carry the essence of us. I was very inspired by many things I heard from the previous sessions. The idea is that translation is a one-way street, that where it falters, dialogue steps in, that without stories, our childhoods and formative years are made war zones. In the past and in the present, we have been given badly put together buckets, which we have had to hold under the waterfalls of our own essential natures in the hope of understanding ourselves, in the hope of having a self that can be shared and understood. To paraphrase a line from the film Jaws, we're going to need a bigger bucket. Funnily enough, this is not the last time that I will mention sharks. In the spirit of all of this, I would like to explode or transform a common story and to introduce a new word. Well, this did not work out exactly as I had planned, but I do embrace failure as a beautiful and creative thing, so just bear with me. I would like to explode and transform the idea of the inherent circular nature of society. One of the stories we are told is that things are circular in nature. Everything comes full circle, the circle of life, history keeps on repeating itself, so on and so forth. Now, don't get me wrong, I really like a circle, I have nothing against them, but in this particular context, the circle supports the idea that things don't really change, not really. The sanctity of the circle tells us that heteronormative, patriarchal, and colonial narratives may wane, but they will return, because history keeps on repeating. However, if we queer the circle, if we translate the circle slightly and challenge it, then perhaps its beginning and its end point don't necessarily have to meet, in which case we no longer have a circle, we have a spiral that has the ability to move in more directions and to forge new paths instead of always following the same route. The word I thought I had created to describe this way of thinking, and apologies to the interpreters because this might be a difficult one, is the word spiracular. I thought it was a new word that combined the idea of a queer spiral with the word spectacular, a word that could mean that great things can come from new ways of thinking. However, I soon learned that this is not a new word. As I sat down today to type this up, I imagined that when I typed out this new word, there would be a moment of joy, that under the word, there would be a small red zigzag line telling me that I had done something very subversive. I imagined right-clicking on it and then selecting Add to Dictionary as an act of rebellion. This did not happen because the word already exists and its already defined meaning relates in the main part to how sharks and other fish breathe underwater. When I realized this and got over the initial disappointment of having not invented a new word, I was actually quite delighted. How appropriate it is that this word should share a meaning that is so inherently queer. Because as queer people, we've had to learn to breathe underwater for a long time. We've had to learn to use words and codes and stories that weren't meant for us, how to exist in cultures that are hostile to us, how to translate our presence when our very presence is contentious. And we've been able to do that. So imagine what we can do when we make new words and stories and cultures with our ability to breathe both on land and in water. When I thought about how much translation we go through, how our expression is defined in many ways by the containers given to us, it made me sad, and then it made me angry, and then it kind of made me joyous as well. How much work we have ahead of us, but how much has already been accomplished. Going back to water. Water, the thing itself, the core metaphor I've been hanging all of this thinking on. Water may take on the shape of the container into which it is poured, but yet it is still itself. A single drop of seawater carries with it the taste of an entire ocean. A single drop of blood, an entire DNA sequence. The essence remains intact. It is then within our power to not only create new possibilities for how we translate our presence into an existing world, but how queer and transformative thinking can translate the world around it. Each of the conversations we have shared these past weeks are not only the seeds of rebellion, but acts of rebellion within themselves that challenge those existing structures. Our very acts of expression are acts of queering the world. They challenge the circle. And right now, the world doesn't really need circles as much as it needs queer spirals. And that's what I think we've been weaving here these last weeks, and which I hope we will continue to weave together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. That was beautiful, and thank you for bringing such different images to the conversation, images and words like spiracular. I have adopted it now in my vocabulary.
Me too, me too.
When you mentioned this circle and the spiral as a new form of maybe building new worlds, it also connects with previous conversations that we had that also relate to the indigenous understandings of time, where the past is here, the future is here as well, and so this brings such interesting images and poetry to this conversation. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing your work at Outburst this year, and thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Gracias. Hermoso lo que nos trajo Dominic con sus metáforas sobre el agua, sobre el tiempo, sobre los círculos infernales, ¿no? Me hizo acordar al círculo infernal de Dante, el infierno de Dante, y cómo salir de esos círculos y crear nuevas espirales donde realmente se pueda desafiar la heteronorma, ¿no? Así que me encantó, espero que lo hayan disfrutado.